Okay, so we want to just get a little bit more clarity on this whole concept that Rav Sharaga has introduced us to, um, that if a person borrows an item like an appliance, here there was some kind of medical appliance, and he gave a check as a collateral item to the lender, and then he loses the appliance. Rav Sharaga wanted to argue that you could say that he's not a standard shoel who's chayiv an ones, because at the same time that the person borrowed the appliance, he also gave an object of value for safekeeping for the lender, and that's considered to be ba'olav imo, which means that the the lender is providing a service. It seems that this it considered to be that the lender is it's considered to be the lender is just like the Torah says that when the lender is present with the borrower at the time that he borrows the appliance, then the borrower is going to be exempt. The same thing is true that when a borrower leaves a mashkon, then it's as if the lender is providing the borrower is providing a service to the, it seems, אבל שואל וחייב כוס בעצום, זה שדיבר שח אומרים דווקא מסר השאלה סמשכן שלא בשעשי שאלה, אבל אם מסר משהו בשעשי שאלה, כיוון שהמשל צריך לשמור על המשכן, ובשעת שאלה נעשה שומר על המשכן, אבי שאלה בבעלם ופטר של בכל חיוביו. The idea is that the lender is providing a service to the borrower at the same time that he's lending him his object, and as a result, it's considered to be ba'alav imo, that the owner is present with the object, just like when I'm present with you, like I'm helping you with the appliance, I'm providing you with a service and therefore I'm exempt. Similarly, if I'm watching an item of yours, when you give it to me for collateral safekeeping, so then I'm providing you with a service. This was challenged in the Makor Baruch, who says it doesn't really make any sense. Because when I take a collateral item, because I've lent you my object of value, my appliance, he says, I'm not doing you a service, I'm doing myself a service, so that I should be able to have something to collect from if you end up losing the item. He says, Sirsur Shanasan Mashkan Labal Hamargolios, Va'abdu Hamargolios, that let's say there's an agent who's a jeweler who's hired on consignment to sell somebody's pearls. So, and the guy who's the jeweler gives collateral to the owner of the pearls to say, if anything happens to these pearls, then you can collect from the collateral. You can't say that if he loses the pearls, he's exempt because the owner is providing a service. He says the owner of the pearls is watching over the collateral item for his own sake, not for the sake of the jeweler. שהוכיח יסודו מדיוק דברי המהרש"ל בפרק הגוזל בסרה, ולא הברי שכן מבואר להדג'ה בדברי הרמ"א הנ"ל שנפסק בשולחן ערוך. And he goes through some more of these questions. ואם כן לפי דבריהם בנידון דידן יש לחייב את השואל דאין כאן פטור של שאלה בבעלם. And therefore, why don't we obligate the shoel to be liable if he loses the appliance? Okay. Uchishasha'alnu kenes Rabbeinu Hagon HaMachaber Shlita, Amar Liyashev, the Shaper Yeshkan Din Petur Shel She'ela Bevalim. So we asked Rav Sharaga this question, and he told us that no, the shoel will be patur. Tahari kol kavanas hamashil haita Laso tova l'shoel. Because the whole objective of the lender is to do a favor for the borrower. V'lochein, gam kishashomer al ha'chek harei l'tovas hashoel. So when he takes the check as collateral, he's not doing it because he wants to help himself. He's doing it because he wants to help the borrower. Because I'm only lending you the appliance with some kind of guarantee, if there's some kind of guarantee that I'll be able to be made whole if you lose the appliance. So I'm doing you a favor by taking the collateral, because if I don't take the collateral, I can't lend you the appliance. Umekabel pikadon v'shomer alav, v'chi hagavna havi hashmira la'atzmo, ve'in liftor mitzad shmira b'va'olim, kevin sha'osa kein la'atzmo. And if, for example, he would have been renting the appliance to a friend, then his taking of the collateral would be for his own benefit. And we wouldn't be able to say that he's providing a service to the renter by watching his appliance. But here, because I'm lending you the appliance for free and I just need to take collateral, I'm really doing this for you. V'imkein yesh lomer gam b'divrei hatumim v'hanasivus, dekevin shahamalva osa tov v'lolova b'masha malva lo as hakesef, afal pishu lokeach mashkan mikol makom masa halva b'chlaloseha im kabolas hamashkan havi l'tova salova. Similarly, when I lend you money and I take collateral, I'm doing you a favor by lending you the money in the first place. So the taking of the collateral is part of the favor. He says, "Uvedas achronim hanal hacholkim al zeh yesh lomar desvirlu dekevin deetzam lekichas hamashkan hayilatzarach atzmo ki yachal lahalvos gam b'li mashkan lechein svirlu denkan din shmira b'va'olim v'dog." He says those who argue with Rav Sharaga will say no, that this is the machlokes between the among these poskim as how we view this kind of situation where a lender who lends out his appliance takes some kind of collateral item in return. Is it considered to be ba'olav imo because he's providing a service at the same time that he's lending the object? He's providing a service to the borrower as well, and therefore the borrower is going to be potter. Or do we say that no, he's by watching over the collateral, he's doing a favor for himself, not doing a favor for the borrower? It's still very, from a logical standpoint, it's somewhat unsatisfactory. But at the end of the day, his psak halacha is clear. His psak halacha is that if a person takes collateral from a borrower, then and the borrower loses something ba'ones, even though normally a borrower is going to be liable for ones, in a case of where the lender took collateral for the item, the borrower will not be chayiv for ones. So a lender has to be aware of that in those situations, if he wants the borrower to be completely liable, he's going to have to not take collateral for it. Yeah. Which again is counterintuitive, but that's how he paskins.
So if you try and protect yourself, you actually end up being less protected in a different way.
Effectively, yeah. That's essentially what he's paskening. Yeah. So we're not so satisfied with it, but we will have to move on. Yeah, but we'll have to move on. Well, it's a machlokes, but Rav Sharaga paskins like those who say that the shoal is going to be potter from ones. Now, let me also point out at the end of the tshuva, he also said that if the check is made out exclusively to the lender, so that it can only be cashed by the lender, then you cannot say he's providing a service. He's doing a favor for the borrower, and therefore the shoal will be chayiv in ones. Okay, let's go on to the next shaila. Shoal dira avur acherim mi achroi al hageneva. A person borrows an apartment for other people. Who's liable for theft? Okay, So here's the shaila. Hayuli orchim michutz la'ir shebou elai l'Shabbos. I had out-of-town guests who came to spend Shabbos with me. V'hashachein nasa lenofesh michutz la'ir. My neighbor went on vacation, so his apartment was empty, and my house, Kanai Nahara, is full, and now these guests are coming. Bikashti mimenu sheyash'il li et dirato litzorech ha'orchem. I asked him if he would do me a favor. Can I house my guests in your apartment? Ubal hadira natan lahem reshut liishtamesh bedira uvarehitim. And the owner of the apartment said, B'simcha, please be my guest. They can stay in my apartment. They can use the beds. They can use the furniture. Let them feel at home. Ha'orchem hishtamshu b'pimutei hakesef shel bal habayit v'hidliku bohen neirot Shabbat. So they used the candelabrum for lighting Shabbos candles. V'yom Shabbos nignavu hapitumim. And then on Shabbos, the candelabra was stolen. So something happened, and the silver was stolen. We don't know. Mi nikra hashoel, ani o ha'orchem shabou b'tzel korati. So who's liable? Am I liable for the candelabrum? Because they borrowed the candelabrum, or am I the borrower because my neighbor lent me the apartment? Okay, so this is a very interesting shaila. Who's liable? Is the neighbor who asked to borrow the apartment liable, or are the neighbor's guests liable for the stolen candelabra? Okay.
So it's not the owner of the candelabra.
The owner of the candelabrum is the owner of the apartment.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So he's not liable for not keeping his apartment safe, having an alarm, chain it down.
Well, maybe it was locked and a guy broke in, and maybe it was properly locked. Yeah, a guy broke, and so we're saying, but remember,
it's possible.
A shoel is liable for onsim. A shoel is liable for onsim. We know that, right? So if I borrow your apartment, I say, Wayne, can I stay at your apartment for Shabbos? And then your apartment gets broken in and they steal goods. So since it's under my watch, I'm liable. So the question now is,
but Rabbi, if you can show that you took necessary care to maintain the security.
even though I took necessary care, but I'm a shoel. A shoel is chayav for onsim. Remember, a borrower who gets all the benefit has complete liability. If I borrow your car and someone crashes into it, I am liable,
It's different from shomer.
right? It's a different from a shomer. You're a shoel. You're a borrower. Borrower assumes full liability.
So you'd think it'd be the person staying there, the ultimate person staying there, as opposed to.
So who's right? So Paul, that's the question. Who's the borrower? Who's borrowing the apartment? Is the neighbor borrowing the apartment, or are the guests borrowing the apartment?
I suggest the guests.
I would say it's the neighbor. He's the one who asked. That if it was contractual law, I would tell you. If it's
I think
contractual law,
I think the
I would
only
say
way
the neighbor's
he's
the
liable,
one who
the guy
set
who
it up.
asks, is if he's the agent for the
Yeah.
people who are actually gonna be in there. They're the
Yeah, but he
principal.
is.
So
He is the agent. He's the one who said.
But maybe only for renting the apartment, but not for the.
No,
thing.
Contents.
Whatever.
I would think
That's
the
the only
person
connection
who
I
made, the person who makes
He's
the
the
agreement,
agent.
the person who makes the agreement is the person who holds the keys. Yeah.
Maybe it's a chain.
Years ago, when my wife and I were first married, we lived in Israel for a year. And she had a friend who lived down in the Negev, where the economic level back then in the 80s was deplorable. So people, like if you were in Kolel in the Negev back then, like you made your own furniture. That's what people, literally, you made your own furniture. And they invited us to come for a Shabbos, and they said, you can stay at our friend's house, they're away. And my wife and I sat down on the couch, and I broke a piece of wood that was holding up the thing. So the guy called me after Shabbos, and he told me, no, it was we had put a bottle of pop in the refrigerator, and something, a piece of plastic, I think, from the refrigerator panel, I think, broke because I put a bottle of pop in there. And the guy who was our host said, you broke that piece, it's going to be $10. And that means, that's a lot of money for them. So I made sure to send the $10 at the time to the guy. So this is the Shiloh. This is the Shiloh. Who's liable?
Rabbi, is it possible to have two borrowers in this case?
Are there two borrowers? Maybe, says Shmuel, they should split. They should split the liability.
One owes the other, who then owes.
Okay, let's take a look at the tshuva. Okay, lichaora misvara hayanira dahameareach et haorchim kevin sha'alav kol machzoram unechshav hashol shel hadira. At first glance, it would seem that the host, which is the guy who's asking to borrow the apartment, he's the liable party. He says, because he's the one who's taking in these people and ensuring their comfort. He's considered to be the borrower of the apartment. Okay, v'chol ha'achrayas olav, and therefore we should say that the whole liability is his. V'im lo haya hashochein maskim lahashel esadira, haya alav lahachnisam letoch beito. And if his neighbor would not have agreed to open up his apartment for these people, then he would have had to bring them into his house. Nimtza shuhu hashoel v'lochein hu chayav al ginevas hapitumim. It turns out that the host, the guy who invited his friends over for Shabbos, is the borrower, and he therefore should be liable for the candelabrum. Ve'ein zedome l'masha kasav b'shulchan aruch. This is not analogous to what is recorded in the Shulchan Aruch about shomer shemasar l'shomer, about a case where one guard asks another guard to watch over an item. Arishon pater v'hasheni nichnas tachtav l'shalem. So the first person, like if you give me an appliance of yours to watch over, and I have to run, so I give over the appliance to my friend and say, here, keep an eye on this. And he says, fine. And then the appliance gets stolen or gets broken. Who's liable? So the Shulchan Aruch says, based on the Gemara, the guy who was watching it, the second guy is liable, because if the owner of the appliance would have consented to let the second guy watch it, right? Okay. Kevin should be mikra shel shomer shemasur l'shomer. Hashomer rishon siyim es tafkido ve'ein lo od kol kesher im hashmira v'lachein kol achrayas al hashomer hasheni. He says, in that kind of scenario, the first shomer, the guy who was originally asked to watch the item, has basically removed himself from liability by giving it to another responsible party. And therefore, the guy who was watching it is going to be liable, the second guy.
A sub-bailee.
A sub-bailee. Okay. Avol b'mikra hazeh, but in this scenario, we don't say that the people who were staying in the apartment are the sub-bailee, and therefore they should be fully liable. He says, Hame'areach mamshich lehanot, she'ha'orchim shelo mistadrim b'veit hamushal, rather. He says, in the case of the shomer, the first shomer has completely recused himself from the situation by giving over the object to a third party who's completely responsible and who the owner would have trusted anyway. But in this situation, and therefore he's getting but in our situation, the host, the guy who invited his guests for Shabbos, he's still benefiting by having the apartment lent out to his guests. So I'm still a party of this system. I'm the one who's benefiting by you opening your apartment and letting my guests stay there. And therefore, he should be the responsible party. That's at first glance. Omnam yesh lahavi raya sheha'orchem yitzchayvu al shmirat hapitumim. On the other hand, we could bring a counter argument that the guests should be liable for the candelabrum. V'raya lazem imasha kasav moran hashulchan aruch isha sheshala eza chayfetz o behema. The Shulchan Aruch paskins that if a woman borrows an appliance, an object, or an animal, kishahaita rivaka, when she was a single woman, v'hachayfetz nishar etzla gam acharei shehit chatna. And so basically, let's say she borrowed her friend's dress, okay? And she keeps the dress in her closet. Then, lo and behold, she gets married. 6 months goes by, she gets married, she still has her friend's dress. Ein labal din shel shomer. The husband, if let's say the apartment gets ransacked and the dress is stolen, who's liable? The woman or her husband, who's now the balabayas? So the Shulchan Aruch paskins, the husband does not assume liability for the stolen dress. Ulefichach im hadavar hashol nenas habal pater, and therefore, if it was a complete onus, the husband is going to be exempt. Afilu shehu hishtamish ba kol yemei she'elasa, even if he ended up using the item also. Well, it's not going to be a dress. Then they've got other issues.
Conversation we had there.
Well, let's say it's a can opener, okay? Instead, okay, yeah, yeah. So so even if he ends up using the can opener, v'ha'isha chayevet l'shalem k'sheyila kesef. And therefore, even though she's a married woman and all of her assets are controlled by her husband, she will still be on the hook and have liability if she acquires any independent assets. But if the woman tells her husband when she gets married, oh, I borrowed this from my girlfriend, hare abal nichnas tachteha benas shol. It's only if she tells him, oh, this I borrowed from my girlfriend, and then he consents to keep it in the house, then he becomes liable. Okay, muchach mikan sha'afal pi sheyesh leisha hana mehashimu shel baila. It seems clear from that illustration that even though the woman gets a benefit from her husband's use of it also, afilu hachi habal hu shenasa shoel kivin shesof sof hu zeh shemishtamesh bepoal. So if the husband ends up using the appliance, uses the can opener or whatever it is, and he benefits from it, so then he now assumes liability. The imkain yeshlomer gam kan the kevin shehaorchim him elu shehishtamshu befoal patumim lachein hem chayavim b'gnei vatam. And therefore, since the guests themselves used the candlesticks, they benefited from the candlesticks. You should argue that they should be liable when they get stolen. So that's the counter argument. On the one hand, the argument is that the host should be liable because he's the one who borrowed the apartment and assumes liability implicitly. On the other hand, we have this halacha that if someone else borrowed an item, but then I use it also because let's say I'm married to the woman, or for some other reason I have permission to utilize the item, then I assume liability if anything happens to it. Va'av shadas hanimuke Yosef hi shafilu im ha'isha hodia labayla shabehema she'ula pater min l'shalem kibin shelo kibul olav shum chiyuv b'shmira. He says the Nimuke Yosef actually paskins that in the case of the girl that gets married and she has a borrowed can opener, even though the husband is benefiting from it Nevertheless, he's potter if it gets stolen or it gets lost, because he never expressly accepted liability to watch over that item. He says, and therefore, according to the Nemuke Yosef, you might be able to argue that the guests never expressly assumed liability for the contents of the apartment. However, Mikol Makom HaShulchan Aruch Sham Pasak Delo Kahani Muke Yosef Uchenizkar Leal. But that's not the psak of the Shulchan Aruch. The psak of the Shulchan Aruch is that the person who benefits is the one who assumes liability. Ule'inyan halacha, and therefore, from a halachic standpoint, nira sheha'orchim chayavim b'genevas hapitumim. It would seem to me that the guests are the liable party, the chayavim l'shalim l'bal habayis aleihem, and they are therefore responsible to pay to the balabayas for the stolen candlesticks. The afal pi shehem lo shalu is hadira v'hachafatzim sheba yeshirut mi balabayas, because even though they did not borrow the apartment directly from the owner, but rather via their host, mikol makom kevin shehem elu sheshalu befoyal, but since they're the ones who are the ones benefiting from the apartment, harehem chayavim be'achrayas hapitumim kemo shahabal chayav b'dvarim sheshala ishto kemo shepasak moran b'shulchan aruch. They are therefore going to be liable, since they are the beneficiaries of the contents of that apartment, and just like a husband is a beneficiary from the things that his wife borrowed. Venira. The ibir seba hadira yuchal legavos mehameareach kevin shehuzeh sheshal es hadira venena ba al yedei sheshichin shomes orchav v'alkein gam hu nechshav l'shol. But it would seem to me also, says Rav Sharaga, that if the owner of the apartment wants to, he can sue his neighbor, because at the end of the day, he's the one who borrowed the apartment. Amnam ba'ofen shama areach omer lo'orchav yesh li shachen shemucha lahashil lachem es atira shalo nira shahachrayas hirak al ha'orchav. In other words, Rav Sharaga is prepared to spread the liability as from the vantage point of the owner of the apartment. The owner of the apartment has the option of suing either party. And if he ends up collecting from the neighbor can go ahead and turn around and collect from his guests. So whichever one is more convenient for the owner, he can turn around and say, pay me for the stolen items. However, that's only true if the whole dealing was between the neighbor and the owner. If the host said to his guests, I have a friend, I have a neighbor who's prepared to lend you his apartment for Shabbos, and do you want to take it? Then in that scenario, nira shahachrayasu rak al ha'orchet. Since he's giving them the option of staying there and they take him up on that option, he's not assuming liability because he's presented it to them in that way. Now, there's a lot to unpack here, but at the end, he sort of basically says that it'll depend on how the option is presented to the guests. If the option is presented to the guests, I'm going to take care of your accommodations, don't worry about it. You just come. When you arrive at my house, knock on the door, you'll come in, I'll give you something to eat, and then I'll give you the key to my neighbor's apartment, and it's yours for Shabbos. So then the host can be sued by the neighbor because he's assumed full liability, and the neighbor has not had any dealings whatsoever with the guests. If, however, the host says to his guests, would you like to borrow the apartment of my neighbor? He's offered to make it available to you. You can stay there. and he gives them the option of saying yes or no. So then he says that changes the relationship, that the guests are the ones, when they say, yes, we'd like to borrow the apartment, they then assume sole liability. Does that make sense, Mark?
Yeah, makes sense.
So the liability on the for the rental of the person who borrows the apartment is irrespective of whether they used the equipment or not, because it started off saying that because they lit the candles, they were going, it showed that they were responsible for the candelabra. But
Yes,
we sort of
so-
moved away from that.
Well, have we? I'm not so sure.
Well, it's-
The Shiloh is presented as they use the candelabrum to light Shabbos candles.
Right.
So what if they never use the candelabrum?
Well,
Or what if what
Something
what if the TV was stolen
Exactly.
and they never turned it on? Yeah,
So it's the same thing. Like,
we'll have to let's look into this for tomorrow. Okay.
So there was a comment about it, whether the borrower assumed